She entered the courtroom as just a maid's daughter, but left with the power to destroy a $500 million scheme. In a quiet courtroom, a powerful man laughed. "What can a maid's daughter possibly do to me?" Judge Harrison Croft sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. But that laugh, meant to belittle, would one day echo back as the first crack in his empire. At just 13, Abigail Peterson was dismissed as invisible. Yet behind her calm blue eyes burned the lessons of her late grandfather. Never let a bully win just because he's bigger. Look for the move he doesn't see coming. What began as a fight to defend her mother would uncover something far darker. A $500 million fraud scheme that reached the highest halls of power. This is the story of how a maid's daughter took on a judge and changed everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. The powerful judge saw only a maid's daughter. He never imagined she would be his downfall. 13-year-old Abigail Peterson fought to quiet the tremor in her hands. Her mother, fading from sickness and debt, had just been cast aside by the very man who held their city in his grip. The silence in Judge Harrison Croft's study was a heavy, expensive thing. It was broken only by the gentle tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner and the soft, rhythmic sound of Eleanor Peterson polishing the mahogany desk. Eleanor moved with a practiced grace, her motions economical and quiet. She had worked in this house for 15 years. She knew every creak of the floorboards, every shadow the afternoon sun cast across the Persian rug. She also knew the man who owned it all. Her daughter, Abigail, sat quietly on a stool near the vast library shelves, a thick book open on her lap. Her blonde hair fell across her face, hiding her intense focus. At 13, Abby was a creature of quiet observation. While other girls her age were concerned with friends and school dances, Abby found comfort in the ordered world of books. She especially loved the ones in the judge's library. They were filled with stories of history, law, and strategy. They felt important. Her mother's cough, a dry and rattling sound, pulled Abby from her reading. She looked up, her brow furrowing with a familiar worry. Eleanor paused her work, leaning against the desk for a moment to catch her breath. A pale sheen of sweat covered her forehead. The medical bills were piling up on their small kitchen table at home, a mountain of paper that seemed to grow taller each week. Eleanor worked every hour she could, but her illness was a cruel thief, stealing her strength day by day. "Mom, you should sit down," Abby whispered, her voice barely disturbing the still air. Eleanor offered a weak but reassuring smile. "I'm all right, sweetheart. Just a little tired." She picked up her polishing cloth again, but before she could resume, the heavy doors to the study swung open. Judge Harrison Croft entered the room. He was a man built of sharp angles and cold authority. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his tailored suit seemed to be an extension of his own rigid posture. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept across the room and landed on Eleanor. He did not acknowledge Abby. In his world, children like her were invisible, like the furniture. "Eleanor," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "We need to talk." Eleanor straightened up, her hands clutching the polishing cloth. "Yes, Judge Croft." He walked to his desk and stood behind it, placing his hands on the gleaming which she had just polished. It was a power pose, one Abby had read about. He was making himself the king of his castle. "Your performance has been lacking recently," he stated. It was not an accusation, it was a verdict. Dust on the mantelpiece, a smudge on the window in the parlor. "It's not acceptable." Eleanor's face, already pale, lost another shade of color. I'm so sorry, sir. I've been feeling a bit under the weather." "It won't happen again." The judge picked up a single, invisible speck of dust from his desk and examined it before flicking it away. "That's the problem, Eleanor. It will happen again. Your condition is becoming a liability." He said the word condition as if it were a character flaw, something she had chosen. Abby felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She closed her book, her knuckles white. She knew what was coming. "I'm afraid I have to let you go," the judge said. "Your services are no longer required." The words hung in the air, brutal and final. Eleanor swayed slightly, her hand flying to her mouth. "But I've worked for you for 15 years. My husband, before he passed, he was your groundskeeper." This job is all we have. Business is business, Eleanor, the judge said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. This will cover your last week. Please gather your things and see yourself out. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she took the envelope. Her hand trembled. Please, Judge Croft. My medical bills. I don't know what we'll do. The judge finally glanced at Abby, his expression one of pure annoyance. That is not my concern. I am not a charity. He turned his back on them, a clear dismissal. Abby slid off the stool. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. Arthur Peterson had been a decorated war veteran, a man of quiet strength and unshakable principle. He had taught Abby how to play chess, how to see the whole board. Never let a bully win just because he's bigger, he used to say. Look for the move he doesn't see coming. She walked forward until she was standing beside her mother. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear, cutting through the heavy silence. You can't do this, she said. Judge Croft turned slowly, an eyebrow raised in mild amusement. He looked down at the small, blonde-haired girl as if she were a curious insect. And who are you to tell me what I can and cannot do in my own home? You're firing her without cause, Abby said, her eyes locked on his. She had read the state labor laws in a book from this very library. She has a perfect record. You owe her severance pay, not just a week's wages. A low chuckle escaped the judge's lips. It was a dry, condescending sound. Is that so? A 13-year-old legal scholar in my study. How quaint. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, intimidating growl. Take your mother and go. Do not make me call security. Eleanor tugged on Abby's arm. Abby, please, let's just go. But Abby didn't move. She held the powerful judge's gaze. This isn't over, she said, her voice filled with a conviction that was far older than her years. Judge Croft laughed again, a full, booming sound this time. He shook his head as if in disbelief. Oh, I assure you, he said, gesturing towards the door. It is. As they walked out of the grand house for the last time, the weight of the judge's laughter followed them. He saw a maid and her little girl, a problem easily discarded. He couldn't see the mind working behind Abby's determined blue eyes. He couldn't see the memory of a soldier who taught his granddaughter to fight. And he certainly couldn't see the chain of events he had just set in motion, a chain that would unravel his entire world. The battle had just begun. Back in their small, two-bedroom apartment, the reality of their situation sank in. The air, usually filled with the scent of Eleanor's gentle cooking, was thick with despair. The envelope from the judge sat on the table, a stark, white reminder of their humiliation. It contained less than $400. Their rent was due in 2 weeks. A new pile of medical bills had arrived in the mail, demanding payment for treatments that were barely keeping Eleanor on her feet. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She wasn't crying, which was somehow worse. It was a silent, hollowed-out grief. What are we going to do, Abby? She whispered, her voice raspy. No one will hire me when they see how sick I am. Abby stood beside her, placing a small hand on her mother's shoulder. She felt a surge of fierce, protective love. Her mother had always been the strong one, the one who worked her fingers to the bone to provide for them after her husband died. Now, it was Abby's turn to be strong. We're going to fight, Abby said simply. Eleanor looked up, her eyes weary. Fight who? Fight him. Abby, he's a judge. He is the law. What can we possibly do? He's just a man, Abby replied, her voice steady. And he broke the rules. I'm going to make him fix it. Over the next few days, Abby became a whirlwind of focused energy. She spent hours at the public library, using their computers to research small claims court procedures. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, watched her with curiosity. She saw a young girl poring over legal texts that would make a law student's head spin. Working on a school project? Mrs. Gable asked one afternoon, placing a glass of water on Abby's table. Something like that, Abby said, not looking up from the screen. She was reading about filing deadlines and evidence submission. She meticulously gathered every piece of her mother's employment history. Pay stubs showing 15 years of loyal service. Old performance reviews, signed by Judge Croft himself, filled with praise for her mother's diligence and honesty. She even found a small, framed photo of her father standing with the judge at a company picnic years ago. They were both smiling. It felt like a relic from another lifetime. When she had everything organized in a neat folder, she approached her mother. "Mom, I need you to sign this," she said, holding out a small claims court filing form. Eleanor stared at the document, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Abby, are you sure about this? What if we make him angrier?" "He's a bully, Mom," Abby said, echoing her grandfather's words. "Bullies count on you being afraid. We have to show him we're not." Hesitantly, Eleanor took the pen and signed her name. A week later, a summons was delivered to Judge Harrison Croft. The notice informed him that he was being sued in small claims court by his former maid, Abigail Peterson, for wrongful termination and unpaid severance. The news of the lawsuit rippled through the judge's social circles. It was seen as a joke. A maid suing a powerful federal judge? The audacity was laughable. Judge Croft himself treated it as a minor annoyance, a gnat to be swatted away. He hired a lawyer, a slick man named Mr. Davies, to handle the matter. The judge didn't even plan to show up. It was beneath him. The day of the hearing arrived. The small claims courtroom was a bland, impersonal room with beige walls and worn-out wooden benches. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and anxiety. Eleanor sat beside Abby at the plaintiff's table. She wore her best church dress and clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked small and fragile under the fluorescent lights. Abby, on the other hand, was a picture of calm focus. She wore a simple blue dress and had her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She had her folder of documents laid out perfectly in front of her. She looked like a child playing dress-up, but her eyes held the seriousness of a seasoned attorney. The defendant's table was occupied by Mr. Davies. He was a man who oozed smug confidence. He kept looking over at Abby and smirking, shaking his head slightly, as if he couldn't believe the absurdity of it all. The presiding judge entered. He was an older man named Judge Miles Thompson. He looked tired but fair. He read the case file and then looked over his glasses at the two tables. "Case number 34B, Peterson versus Croft," he announced. "Is the plaintiff, Abigail Peterson, present?" Eleanor stood up on shaky legs. "Yes, Your Honor." "And is the defendant, Harrison Croft, present?" Mr. Davies stood. "Your Honor, I am Marcus Davies, representing Judge Croft. My client had a pressing judicial matter and was unable to attend." Judge Thompson frowned, clearly unimpressed. "I see. And who will be speaking for the plaintiff?" Abby stood up. "I will, Your Honor." A ripple of murmurs went through the small gallery of onlookers. Mr. Davies let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Judge Thompson peered at Abby. "And you are?" "I am Abigail Peterson, Your Honor. I am the plaintiff's daughter." The judge leaned forward, his expression a mixture of confusion and impatience. "Young lady, this is a court of law, not a school play. You cannot represent your mother. You're a child." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Abby said, her voice clear and strong. "The rules for small claims court in this state allow for a person to be represented by a family member with the court's permission, especially in cases of hardship. My mother is ill and under great stress. I have prepared the case." She spoke with such authority that Judge Thompson was momentarily taken aback. He looked at Eleanor, who nodded timidly. "Is this your wish, Mrs. Peterson?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor whispered. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is highly irregular, but I will allow it for now. Proceed, Miss Peterson. State your case." Mr. Davies was still smirking. This was going to be even more amusing than he had thought. Abby took a deep breath. "Thank you, Your Honor. My mother, Abigail Peterson, was employed by Judge Harrison Croft as a housekeeper for 15 years. During that time, she never received a single complaint about her work. We have copies of her performance reviews to prove it." She slid a set of documents across the table. "On the 14th of last month, Judge Croft fired my mother without warning. He claimed her performance was lacking. He gave her 1 week's pay and told her to leave. According to state law, an employee with her length of service, terminated without documented cause, is entitled to severance pay. We are asking the court to award my mother the severance she is owed, which amounts to 15 weeks of pay." She laid out her case with simple, undeniable facts. She was clear, concise, and professional. The smirk on Mr. Davies' face began to fade slightly. When she was finished, Judge Thompson turned to the defense. "Mr. Davies, your response?" Mr. Davies stood, straightening his tie. "Your Honor, while my client appreciates Mrs. Peterson's years of service, her termination was not without cause. In fact, It was more than justified. He paused for dramatic effect. My client, Judge Croft, fired Mrs. Peterson because she was stealing from him. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Eleanor's face went white with shock. That's not true, she cried out. Silence, Judge Thompson ordered, banging his gavel. Abby's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. This was a move she hadn't anticipated. A lie so blatant, so cruel. Mr. Davies continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. My client was reluctant to bring this up, to protect Mrs. Peterson from criminal charges. He is a compassionate man. But since she has forced his hand with this frivolous lawsuit, the truth must be told. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a glossy photograph. We have evidence, he said, placing the photo on the evidence table. This is a security camera still from the day of the termination. It clearly shows Mrs. Peterson slipping a silver letter opener from my client's desk into her apron pocket. Judge Thompson examined the photograph. It did, indeed, appear to show exactly what Mr. Davies claimed. He looked at Eleanor with a new, hardened expression. Mrs. Peterson, the judge said, his voice cold. Is this true? No, I would never. Eleanor sobbed, her composure finally breaking. I never stole anything in my life. Mr. Davies looked at Abby with a triumphant gleam in his eye. He had won. A photograph doesn't lie. The maid's daughter had walked right into his trap. But Abby wasn't looking at her mother or the judge. She was looking at the photograph. Her mind, trained by years of observation and her grandfather's lessons in strategy, was racing. She saw the whole board. And she saw the one, tiny detail that Mr. Davies and Judge Croft had missed. The one detail that would prove this was all a lie. She stood up. Your Honor, she said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. May I approach the evidence? Judge Thompson nodded, and Abby walked to the table. She picked up the photograph, her eyes scanning it intently. She could feel Mr. Davies' smug gaze on her, waiting for her to crumble. He was about to be very disappointed. She turned to face him, the photograph held carefully in her hand. Mr. Davies, she said, her voice steady. You said this photo was taken on the day my mother was fired, correct? That's right, he said smoothly. And what time was she fired? Mr. Davies glanced at his notes. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Abby held up the picture for the judge to see. Her finger pointed to a small detail in the background, behind the desk where her mother was standing. It was the grandfather clock that stood in Judge Croft's study. Then can you please explain, Abby asked, her voice clear and sharp, why the clock in this photograph says it's 9 o'clock in the morning? The courtroom fell silent. Mr. Davies' confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned confusion. He stared at the photograph, then back at Abby. He had no answer. Abby wasn't finished. She pointed to another detail. And can you explain why the digital calendar on Judge Croft's desk, which is always on, shows the date as being from the week before my mother was fired? The silence in the room was now deafening. Every eye was on Abby. She was no longer a little girl playing lawyer. She was a warrior who had just found the enemy's weakness. This photograph is a fake, Your Honor, Abby declared, her voice resonating with the pure, simple power of the truth. It was created to ruin my mother's name. And I can prove it. The tides of the battle had just turned. And Judge Harrison Croft, sitting in his quiet, expensive study across town, had no idea that the war had truly just begun. Mr. Davies, the slick lawyer, sputtered like a car engine failing to start. That's preposterous. It's a trick of the light. The angle. Judge Thompson silenced him with a sharp look. He leaned over his bench, peering at the photograph Abby still held. He motioned for the bailiff. Bring me that evidence. The bailiff carried the photograph to the judge, who examined it closely for a long moment. He looked at the clock. He looked at the digital calendar on the desk. He then looked up, his gaze settling on Mr. Davies with the weight of a glacier. Mr. Davies, the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. As an officer of the court, you are aware of the penalties for presenting falsified evidence, are you not? The lawyer's face was now ashen. The smug confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the raw panic of a man who saw his career flashing before his eyes. Your Honor, my client provided this to me. I had no reason to believe. I was assured of its authenticity. You were assured? Judge Thompson repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. You saw fit to accuse a woman of theft, to potentially ruin her life, based on a photograph you didn't even bother to properly examine yourself. Abby stood tall, but her legs were beginning to tremble. She had thrown the punch. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She felt her mother's hand find hers under the table, a small, grateful squeeze. "This court," Judge Thompson declared, his voice booming now, "does not take kindly to being lied to. It seems to me that the only crime committed here was the creation of this fraudulent photograph." He turned his attention to Abby. "Miss Peterson, your mother's claim for severance is granted in full. Furthermore, I am awarding an additional sum for punitive damages, given the defendant's malicious and defamatory actions here today." He banged his gavel with a resounding crack that echoed through the room. "This hearing is concluded." Tears of relief streamed down Eleanor's face. She hugged Abby tightly, burying her face in her daughter's blonde hair. "You did it," she whispered. "Oh, Abby, you did it." As they were leaving, a shaken and furious Mr. Davies cornered them in the hallway. "You think you're clever, don't you, little girl?" he hissed, his face contorted in an ugly sneer. "You just made a very powerful enemy. This isn't over." Abby met his glare without flinching. "Tell your boss to pay my mother what he owes her," she said, her voice cold as steel. "And tell him to stop lying." She took her mother's hand and walked away, leaving the lawyer fuming in the hallway. The victory felt monumental, a David and Goliath story played out in a tiny courtroom. For a few days, a fragile sense of hope returned to their small apartment. The money from the judgment, once it arrived, would be enough to cover the rent and the most urgent medical bills. It was a lifeline, but the check did not arrive. A week passed. Then two. Abby made calls to the court clerk, who confirmed the judgment had been processed. The delay was on Judge Croft's end. He was simply refusing to pay. It was a petty, arrogant act of defiance. He was above the rules. He was the law. Eleanor's health took a sharp downturn. The stress of the situation was a poison, weakening her already fragile body. The doctor said she needed a new series of expensive treatments they couldn't possibly afford without the settlement money. The mountain of debt grew taller, casting a dark shadow over their small victory. Abby felt a familiar fire of anger and injustice burning within her. Judge Croft wasn't just a bully, he was cruel. He was trying to break them, to make them suffer for daring to stand up to him. Her grandfather's voice returned to her, a calm and steady presence in the chaos of her thoughts. Sometimes the enemy's biggest strength is also his biggest weakness. An arrogant man always leaves a trail. A trail. Abby knew she couldn't fight him head-on in another courtroom. He would be prepared this time. He would use his power and influence to crush them. She had to find another way. She had to find his trail. Her mind went back to the judge's study. The vast library, the mahogany desk, the grandfather clock. She had spent countless hours in that room, waiting for her mother to finish her work. She knew its layout, its contents. Her mind, a sponge for details, began to sift through the memories. She remembered the judge's meticulous nature. He kept records of everything. His financial ledgers, bound in dark green leather, were kept on a specific shelf, right next to the antique globe. He had always been very secretive about those books. Once, when Abby had reached for one out of curiosity, he had snapped at her with a ferocity that was startling. "Never touch those," he had commanded. At the time, she had thought he was just protective of his expensive belongings. Now, she wondered if he was protecting something else. An idea, wild and dangerous, began to form in her mind. It was a desperate plan, born of a daughter's love and a righteous fury. She knew it was wrong. She knew the risks. But when she looked at her mother, pale and fading in her armchair, she knew she had no other choice. She had to get back into that house. She had to see what was in those green leather books. The Croft estate was a fortress. High walls, security cameras, and a state-of-the-art alarm system. Getting in would be impossible. But Abby wasn't thinking about breaking in. She was thinking about being let in. The judge hosted an annual charity gala at his home. It was a major social event, attended by the city's most wealthy and powerful figures. It was also catered, and catering companies hired temporary staff. Using the last of their emergency money, Abby bought a simple, black-and-white uniform from a second-hand store. She found the name of the catering company online, and, with a bit of clever social engineering, a phone call pretending to be a culinary student confirming a work-study placement, she learned the arrival time for the event staff. On the night of the gala, Abby put her plan into motion. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped into the line of catering staff arriving at the service entrance. She was a ghost, a small girl in a simple uniform, her face obscured by the tray of champagne glasses she carried. No one gave her a second look. She was invisible, just as she had been in the judge's study for years. The house was transformed. Music drifted from the ballroom. The scent of expensive perfume and rich food filled the air. Abby moved through the crowds, her eyes scanning, observing. She saw Judge Croft holding court, laughing with senators and CEOs, the picture of charm and integrity. The sight of him, so confident and untouchable, made her stomach clench. Her mission was clear. She needed to get to the study. It was on the second floor, at the end of the West Wing, a private sanctuary that would be off-limits to guests. She found a quiet hallway and slipped a small, folded sign from her pocket. Restroom temporarily closed for cleaning. She placed it at the bottom of the grand staircase. It was a simple diversion, but it might buy her a few precious minutes. Her heart pounded with every step as she ascended the carpeted stairs. The music and laughter from the party below began to fade, replaced by the heavy, imposing silence of the private quarters. She reached the door to the study. It was unlocked. She slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The room was just as she remembered it. The smell of old books and lemon polish, the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, a silent witness. She moved quickly, her feet silent on the thick rug. She went straight to the bookshelf and found the row of dark green ledgers. Her fingers trembled as she pulled one from the shelf. She opened it on the desk, the same desk her mother had polished for so many years. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and names. At first, it looked like a simple record of investments and expenses. But Abby saw something else. She saw patterns. Names of shell corporations she recognized from her research at the library. Large, repeated payments to offshore accounts. Transfers of funds between seemingly unrelated entities. It was a complex web of transactions, designed to be confusing, to hide the truth. But Abby saw more than just numbers. She saw names. The names of construction companies that won city contracts. The names of other judges. The names of politicians. And next to their names, there were figures. Huge sums of money. It wasn't just a financial ledger. It was a record of bribery. A blueprint of corruption on a massive scale. Her breath caught in her throat. This was bigger than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about her mother's job. It was a citywide conspiracy, a fraud scheme worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And Judge Harrison Croft was at the very center of it all. She knew she couldn't take the ledger with her. That would be theft. That would make her a criminal. Her grandfather had taught her to be smarter than that. The best weapon is the one your enemy gives you. Her eyes darted around the room and landed on the judge's high-tech scanner and printer, the one he used for his legal documents. She worked quickly, her hands flying across the buttons. She scanned page after page, her heart pounding in her ears. The machine whirred softly, a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. She saved the digital files to a tiny, encrypted flash drive she had brought with her, a piece of technology she had learned about from a book on modern espionage. Just as the last page was scanning, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Panic seized her. She quickly closed the ledger, slid it back into its exact spot on the shelf, and grabbed the flash drive. The doorknob began to turn. There was nowhere to hide. The room was vast, with little furniture to conceal even a small girl. She did the only thing she could think of. She dove behind the heavy velvet curtains that flanked the large window, pressing herself flat against the cold glass. The door opened, and Judge Croft walked in. He was not alone. With him was another man, a man whose face Abby recognized from the news. It was Senator Thompson, a man who preached about family values and fiscal responsibility. "I'm telling you, Harrison, the investigation is getting too close," the senator said, his voice a low, worried murmur. "This reporter, this Miller woman, she's been digging into the public works contracts. She's asking questions about the bidding process." Judge Croft walked to his desk and poured 2 glasses of brandy. He handed one to the senator. "Let her dig," the judge said, his voice calm and arrogant. "The paper trail is a labyrinth. No one can make sense of it. The ledgers are a masterpiece of misdirection." He took a sip of his brandy. "Besides, who is a jury going to believe? A respected federal judge and a sitting senator, or some muckraking journalist? The senator still looked nervous. What about the maid? The one who sued you? What if she talks? What if she saw something over the years? Judge Croft let out that same, dismissive laugh that Abby remembered from the day he fired her mother. The maid? She saw nothing. She was just part of the furniture. And even if she did, who would listen to her? She's a sick, desperate woman. Her daughter is a delinquent who forged evidence in a courtroom. I've already had my legal team file a motion to appeal that ridiculous judgment and press charges against the girl for perjury. By the time I'm done with them, they'll have no credibility left. Behind the curtain, Abby's blood ran cold. He wasn't just refusing to pay. He was planning to destroy them, to paint her as a criminal, to discredit her, to protect himself. The two men finished their drinks, their conversation turning to stock portfolios and vacation homes. Abby held her breath, praying they wouldn't look toward the window. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they left the study, closing the door behind them. Abby waited, her body trembling, until she was sure they were gone. She slipped out from behind the curtain, the tiny flash drive clutched in her hand. It felt as heavy as a block of cement. It was her only weapon. It was everything. She crept out of the study and down the stairs, her invisibility her only shield. She blended back in with the catering staff, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. She walked out of the service entrance and into the cool night air, never looking back. She had the evidence. She had the truth. But as the judge's cruel words echoed in her mind, she knew that having the truth and making people believe it were two very different things. He was a powerful judge. She was just a maid's daughter. He was already painting her as a liar. How could a 13-year-old girl convince the world that the most powerful man in the city was a master criminal? The next battle would not be fought in a courtroom. It would be fought for the truth itself. And she was going to need allies. She walked home through the sleeping city, the adrenaline from her infiltration slowly giving way to a bone-deep weariness and a chilling fear. The judge's words echoed in her mind. Her daughter is a delinquent. I've already had my legal team file a motion to press charges against the girl for perjury. He wasn't just going to fight her. He was going to erase her. He was going to turn her into a criminal in the eyes of the law, making anything she said, any evidence she presented, worthless. She knew she couldn't go to the police. The ledgers had implicated dozens of powerful people, including police officials and prosecutors. The system wasn't just broken, it was owned. Handing the flash drive over to the authorities would be like handing a weapon back to her enemy. There was only one name that offered a sliver of hope: Miller, the reporter the senator was so afraid of. This reporter, this Miller woman, she's been digging, he'd said. Miller was already on the trail. She just didn't have the map. Abby had the map. The next morning, Abby found her at the public library. Not in person, but in the digital archives. Her name was Rachel Miller, an investigative journalist for the city's largest independent newspaper, The Clarion. She had a reputation for being relentless, a bulldog who sank her teeth into stories of public corruption and never let go. She had brought down a city councilman for taking kickbacks and exposed a corporate polluter who was poisoning a local river. She was exactly the ally Abby needed. Finding her was one thing. Reaching her was another. Abby couldn't just walk into the Clarion offices. Judge Croft would have people watching, listening. Her grandfather had told her stories from the war, stories about codes and dead drops, about how to pass information securely when the enemy was everywhere. She would have to be just as careful. She created an anonymous email account at the library, using a public computer and a series of proxy servers to mask her location, a technique she'd learned from one of the judge's own books on cybersecurity. She composed a short, cryptic message to Rachel Miller's publicly listed email address. Subject: a map for your journey. Message: you are digging for treasure, but you are in the wrong part of the forest. The real treasure is buried much deeper, at the foot of the oldest tree. I can give you the map. If you want it, place a small ad in the classifieds of your own paper. The ad should be for a lost golden locket, sentimental value. List a phone number for a disposable burner phone. I will call it on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Come alone. She hit send, her finger hovering over the mouse for a moment. This was it. She was stepping out of the shadows. The risk was immense. What if Miller was also corrupt? What if she turned the information over to the judge? It was a leap of faith, a bet placed on the integrity of a stranger. For 2 days, Abby lived in a state of suspended anxiety. She checked the online edition of the Clarion every hour. Her mother, Eleanor, saw the change in her. Abby was quiet, withdrawn, the weight of her secret a visible burden on her small shoulders. "Abby, what's wrong?" Eleanor asked, her voice filled with concern. "You've barely eaten. Is this about the judge? About the money?" Abby wanted to tell her everything, to unburden herself of the terrifying knowledge she carried. But she couldn't. Her mother was already so fragile. This would break her. So Abby just shook her head and forced a smile. "I'm just thinking, Mom. I'm working on a new plan." On Sunday morning, it appeared, tucked away in the classifieds, between an ad for a used lawnmower and another for a lost parrot, was a small, two-line notice. "Lost golden locket, sentimental value. If found, please call 555-0182. Abby's heart leaped. Rachel Miller had gotten the message. The meeting was on. The next 2 days were the longest of Abby's life. She bought a cheap burner phone with the last of her cash. She scouted locations, finally settling on a busy public park. There would be people everywhere, witnesses. It was safer than a secluded spot. Her grandfather had taught her that, too. Never meet an unknown contact in a place they choose. Always control the environment. On Tuesday, at exactly 2:55 p.m., Abby sat on a bench overlooking a duck pond, the burner phone clutched in her sweaty palm. She was wearing a hoodie and a baseball cap, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. She saw a woman walk into the park, talking on her phone. The woman had reddish-brown hair tied in a messy bun and wore a rumpled trench coat. She looked tired, stressed, and exactly like the pictures Abby had seen online. It was Rachel Miller. At 3 p.m. on the dot, Abby dialed the number. Rachel stopped walking, her conversation ending abruptly. She answered the call. "Hello. You're wearing a green scarf," Abby said, her voice disguised, lower than her natural pitch. "You're standing near the hot dog vendor." On the other end of the line, Rachel's eyes scanned the park. "Who is this?" "I have the map you're looking for," Abby said. "It proves everything. The public works contracts, the bribery, all of it. It all leads back to Judge Harrison Croft." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" "You don't," Abby admitted. "But the senator you've been investigating is scared of what I have. And so is the judge. That should be enough." "Where do you want to meet?" Rachel asked, her voice now sharp with professional focus. "We are meeting," Abby said. "I'm watching you right now, but we're not going to talk face-to-face. It's too dangerous. Go to the public library. In the nonfiction section, aisle 7B, there's a large book on the history of the Roman Empire. The flash drive is inside it. It's encrypted. The password is the last name of the man who prosecuted the Nuremberg trials. It was a test. A real investigative journalist would know the name." There was a pause. Then, Rachel said, "Robert Jackson." "I'll be in touch," Abby said, and ended the call. She watched as Rachel Miller, a look of stunned disbelief on her face, turned and walked briskly out of the park. Abby waited for a full 10 minutes, making sure she wasn't being followed, before she slipped away, a ghost in the afternoon crowd. The next 24 hours were a blur of nervous anticipation. Abby stayed home, watching the news, refreshing the Clarion's website, waiting for the earthquake. Eleanor's condition worsened. A new notice arrived from their landlord, a formal warning of eviction. The judge was tightening his grip, squeezing them from all sides. Then, on Thursday morning, the story broke. The headline on the front page of the Clarion was explosive, printed in the largest font Abby had ever seen. Judge, Senator implicated in $500 million citywide fraud scheme. Rachel Miller's article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It laid out the entire conspiracy in painstaking detail, supported by scanned copies of the ledger pages Abby had provided. The story was instantly picked up by national news outlets. The city was thrown into chaos. The FBI announced a federal investigation. Senator Thompson's office issued a frantic denial. Judge Croft's chambers were silent. Abby and Eleanor watched the news reports on their small television, their faces illuminated by the flickering screen. Eleanor looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with a dawning understanding. "Abby," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The things they're saying, the ledgers, was that you?" Abby simply nodded, the tears she had been holding back for weeks finally spilling over. Eleanor pulled her into a fierce hug, a hug that was filled with terror and an overwhelming pride. "My brave girl," she cried softly. "My brave, brave girl." The victory, however, was far from complete. The judge was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. While the FBI was building its case, Croft was still a federal judge. He still had power, and he was going to use it. That evening, there was a sharp, official knock at their apartment door. Two uniformed police officers stood in the hallway. One of them held up a warrant. "Abigail Peterson?" the officer asked, his voice flat and emotionless. "Yes," Abby said, her heart sinking. "You are under arrest." "Arrest?" Eleanor cried, rushing to the door. "For what?" "For breaking and entering, theft of private property, and perjury," the officer recited, his eyes avoiding theirs. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The cold metal gleamed under the dim hallway light. Judge Croft was making his move. He couldn't win in the court of public opinion, so he was going to drag Abby into his court, the one where he still made the rules, and destroy her. The hero of the city was about to be branded a common criminal. Her mother cried out, a raw, wounded sound, and tried to step forward, but the second officer held up a firm hand to block her. "You can't do this. She's a child," Eleanor pleaded, her voice breaking. "She's the one who told the truth." "Ma'am, you need to step back," the officer said, his tone not unkind, but resolute. "We have a warrant. We're just doing our job." Abby stood frozen, the coldness of the steel seeping into her skin. She looked from her mother's terrified face to the impassive faces of the officers. This was Judge Croft's power. It wasn't just about money or influence. It was the power to turn reality upside down, to transform a hero into a felon with a single sheet of paper. Her grandfather's words came back to her, not a strategic lesson this time, but a stark warning he had given her once about the nature of powerful men. When you take away their reputation, they will stop at nothing to take away your freedom. They led her from the apartment, down the dimly lit hallway, and into the night. Neighbors peeked through their doors, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Abby held her head high, her expression a mask of calm she did not feel. She refused to give the judge the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The police station was a harsh, sterile environment of fluorescent lights, beige walls, and the smell of disinfectant. They put her in a small, windowless room. The process was a dehumanizing blur of fingerprints, photographs, and questions she refused to answer. She knew her rights, learned from the very books the judge kept in his library. She asked for a lawyer. The irony was crushing. She, who had just exposed a massive conspiracy, was being treated like a common criminal, while the real criminals sat in their mansions, protected by the very system that was now processing her like a piece of evidence. The news of her arrest spread like wildfire. It was a shocking, audacious move by Judge Croft, and it backfired spectacularly. The public, who had hailed Abby as a young hero, was outraged. How could the girl who exposed the city's biggest scandal be the one in handcuffs? Protesters began to gather outside the police station, their numbers swelling by the hour. They held signs that read, "Free Abby Peterson," and "Justice for the girl who dared." Rachel Miller, the journalist, was a whirlwind of fury and action. Her phone had been ringing off the hook since the story broke, but when she heard about Abby's arrest, she dropped everything. She knew this was the judge's retaliation, a desperate and vicious attempt to silence his accuser. She called the best pro bono lawyer in the city, a legendary civil rights attorney named Samuel Page. Samuel Page was a man in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair and eyes that had seen the very worst and the very best of humanity. He had spent his life fighting for the underdog, for the voiceless, for the victims of a system that often favored the rich and powerful. He had read Rachel's story and was already captivated by the case. The news of the 13-year-old's arrest was all the motivation he needed. He arrived at the police station just after midnight, his presence commanding immediate respect. He walked into the small room where Abby was being held. She looked up, her face pale but her eyes defiant. "Abigail Peterson," he said, his voice a deep, reassuring rumble. "My name is Samuel Page. I'm your lawyer." For the first time that night, Abby felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Abby's arraignment was the biggest news story in the country. The courtroom was packed with reporters, television cameras, and supporters. When Abby was let in, still wearing her hoodie and jeans, A wave of supportive murmurs rippled through the gallery. She looked so small, so young, standing before the judge's bench. Judge Croft was, of course, not presiding. The judge on the bench was a woman named Maria Sanchez, known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense demeanor. The prosecutor, a man handpicked by Croft's allies in the district attorney's office, laid out the charges with dramatic flair: breaking and entering, theft, perjury. He painted Abby as a troubled, delinquent child, a liar who had fabricated a wild story to defame a respected judge. When he was finished, Samuel Page rose to his feet. He was not dramatic. He was calm, his voice filled with a quiet, righteous anger. "Your Honor," he began, "what the prosecution has just described is not a series of crimes. It is a work of fiction, a desperate and malicious narrative crafted by a guilty man, Harrison Croft, to intimidate a witness in a federal investigation." He looked directly at the prosecutor. "The prosecution speaks of breaking and entering. Yet, the scene of the crime is a place my client knew intimately, a place where her mother worked for 15 years. He speaks of theft. Yet, nothing was stolen. The information on that flash drive was copied, not taken. It was evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy. Evidence, I might add, that the FBI is now using to bring down some of the most powerful men in this city." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And he speaks of perjury. The charge is that this 13-year-old girl lied in small claims court about a photograph. A photograph that was proven, in that very court, to be a fabrication. The only perjury committed in relation to this case was by Harrison Croft's legal team when they submitted that fraudulent evidence." He then turned to Judge Sanchez. "Your Honor, the person who should be in this courtroom, in handcuffs, is Harrison Croft. Instead, he has used his dwindling power to manipulate the justice system to persecute a child whose only crime was telling the truth. We plead not guilty to all charges, and we ask that my client be released on her own recognizance immediately." The courtroom was silent, captivated. Judge Sanchez looked down at Abby, then at the mountain of paperwork before her. She was a smart woman. She could see what was happening. She knew this case was a political hot potato, a battle between a crumbling old guard and the forces of justice. "Bail is set at $1, Judge Sanchez declared, her voice firm. It was a symbolic gesture, a slap in the face to the prosecution and to Judge Croft. "And I am issuing a gag order on all parties, including Harrison Croft. This case will be tried in a court of law, not in the media." The release was a victory, but the war was far from over. Abby was free, but the charges still stood. Judge Croft's strategy was clear. He would use the legal system to bleed them dry, to bury them in motions and hearings, to drag the process out for months, even years. He knew that justice delayed is often justice denied. In the weeks that followed, life for Abby and Eleanor was a strange paradox. They were at the center of a national media storm, their faces on every news channel. Donations poured in from supporters across the country. A fund managed by Rachel Miller and Samuel Page to help with their living expenses and Eleanor's medical bills. For the first time, Eleanor was able to see the best doctors, to get the treatments she so desperately needed. The lifeline they had prayed for had finally arrived, a gift from thousands of strangers who believed in her daughter. But the threat of the trial loomed over them. Abby met with Samuel Page regularly, preparing for the fight of her life. The legal strategy Croft was using was insidious. He wasn't trying to disprove the fraud. He was focusing entirely on Abby's actions. The core of his case was simple. No matter how noble her intentions, she had broken the law to get the evidence. The fruit of the poisonous tree. If he could get the ledger scans thrown out, the FBI's case against him would be weakened, and his own charges against Abby would stick. He was trying to use the letter of the law to suffocate the spirit of the law. Abby felt the weight of it all. She was just a girl who loved books and her mother. Now, the fate of the city, and her own freedom, rested on her shoulders. She spent her days with Samuel, going over every detail, every memory of her time in the Croft house. He was impressed by her intelligence and her incredible memory. "You have what lawyers call a total recall, Abby," he said one afternoon, a look of admiration in his eyes. "You see things other people miss." It was during one of these sessions that Abby remembered something small, something that seemed insignificant at the time. It was a conversation she had overheard weeks before her mother was fired. Judge Croft was in his study, on a heated phone call. He was yelling, something he rarely did. "The transfer has to be untraceable," he had shouted into the phone. "Use the Veterans Fund. No one ever looks at the accounts for the Veterans Fund. It's a black hole." Abby hadn't thought much of it then. But now, telling Samuel, the words took on a sinister new meaning. The Veterans Fund. It was a well-known city charity, a fund set up to help homeless and disabled veterans. Her own grandfather, Arthur Peterson, had donated to it his entire life. Samuel Page's eyes lit up with a cold fire. "A black hole," he repeated softly. "Harrison Croft is a veteran himself. He served as a JAG officer. He sits on the board of that fund." A new, sickening piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The judge wasn't just a fraudster and a briber. He was stealing from his own. He was stealing from men like her grandfather. It was a betrayal of the deepest, most sacred kind. And Abby knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had just found the key that would not only win her case, but would be the final, devastating nail in Harrison Croft's coffin. The discovery of the Veterans Fund was more than a new piece of evidence. It was a moral thunderbolt. Samuel Page and Rachel Miller knew its power instantly. This wasn't a complex financial crime anymore. It was about a man stealing from the nation's heroes, from the memory of men like Arthur Peterson. It was a betrayal everyone could understand. Rachel Miller's next headline for the Clarion was devastating. Judge Croft accused of looting Veterans Charity Fund. She detailed how Croft had allegedly siphoned millions from the fund, using the charity as a black hole to launder money. The article featured a photo of Abby's grandfather in his old Army uniform, a symbol of the very people Croft had betrayed. The public reaction was visceral. Protests swelled from hundreds to thousands. Veterans groups issued statements of condemnation. The pressure on the FBI became immense. Judge Croft, once a titan of the city, was now a pariah. The day of Abby's trial was a media circus. Croft's plan was still in motion: convict Abby, discredit her as a witness, and poison the evidence she had uncovered. The prosecution presented its case first, methodically building an argument that, by the strict letter of the law, Abby was guilty. They rested on a simple, cold legal principle: the ends do not justify the means. Then, Samuel Page rose. The defense calls Abigail Peterson to the stand. A hush fell as Abby walked to the witness stand. She looked small in the large wooden chair as she took the oath, her voice clear and steady. Samuel began gently, asking about her mother and grandfather, painting a picture not of criminal intent, but of a daughter's desperate love. "Abby," he asked, "why did you go back to Judge Croft's house that night?" Abby looked at the jury. "Because he was trying to destroy my mother," she said. "He lied about her and was going to accuse me of being a criminal just for telling the truth. I knew he was a bully, but I realized he was something much worse. I had to find out why." Samuel walked her through the discovery of the ledgers. She explained the complex fraud in simple terms, her extraordinary intelligence on full display. Finally, he asked her about the Veterans Fund. Abby recounted hearing Judge Croft on the phone, yelling about using the fund as a black hole. A wave of revulsion went through the courtroom. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to twist her words, to portray her as a vindictive child who thought she was above the law. "You admit you broke into a private residence, don't you?" he thundered. "I walked through an unlocked door to find the truth," Abby replied calmly. "You admit that you copied private financial records?" "I found evidence of a massive criminal conspiracy," she countered. "You decided to take the law into your own hands," he accused. Abby paused, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on the judge's empty chair. The law? Judge Croft was the law in this city. He used it as a shield to protect himself and as a weapon to hurt people like my mother. I didn't take the law into my own hands. I brought the evidence to the people who could actually bring him to justice. She looked back at the jury, her blue eyes shining with fierce honesty. "My grandfather was a war veteran. He taught me that you always stand up for what's right." Judge Croft, a man who swore an oath to uphold the law, was stealing from men like my grandfather. He was stealing from heroes. "If finding the proof of that is a crime," she said, her voice dropping to a powerful whisper, "then I am guilty." The courtroom was utterly still. In that moment, she was not a child or a defendant. She was the conscience of the city. Samuel Page's closing argument was brief. The law was created to protect the innocent and punish the guilty, he said. Do not allow it to be twisted today to do the exact opposite. The jury was out for less than an hour. Abby stood with her mother and Samuel as the foreperson read the verdict. Eleanor gripped her daughter's hand. On the charge of breaking and entering, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. A wave of applause erupted. On the charge of theft, we find the defendant not guilty. Eleanor was sobbing openly now, tears of joy. On the charge of perjury, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom exploded. Justice, true and undeniable, had prevailed. In the aftermath, Judge Croft's empire crumbled. He and his powerful friends were indicted. Stripped of his power, he was just a criminal facing a lifetime in prison. Months later, Abby and Eleanor sat on a park bench. The sun was warm. Eleanor's health had returned, the lines of worry on her face replaced by a quiet peace. A newspaper beside them read, Croft sentenced to 30 years in prison. It's finally over, Eleanor said softly, placing her hand over Abby's. Abby looked out at the duck pond. He laughed at me, she said quietly. He thought I was nothing. Eleanor squeezed her hand. He didn't see you, Abby, she said, her voice filled with pride. He didn't see the granddaughter of Arthur Peterson. He didn't see the smartest, bravest person I have ever known. Abby leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. The long battle was over. The silence was no longer heavy or expensive. It was peaceful. It was earned. A new story was beginning, not of fighting and fear, but of hope, and the unshakable truth that even the smallest voice, speaking for what is right, can be the most powerful force in the world. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.